Hey everyone, my name is Eric Masalski, and in this tutorial we're going to be continuing the organic modeling series by setting up the texturing coordinates, or mapping coordinates, for the head here. Now this process is a fairly lengthy one, so we're going to be handling this in two steps, or two parts. So let's get started. If you load the file that came with the tutorial and move over to the Modify panel, you'll see that we have two setups here. We have a symmetry modifier with an editable poly underneath. Now what we want to do is we only want to set up the mapping coordinates for one side of this, because we'll then use a symmetry modifier to duplicate it to the other side, thus saving us a lot of work. So if you make sure that your editable poly is the current modifier, make sure you are not in sub-object mode. And then click on Unwrap UVW modifier from the drop-down list. So you can see we now have an Unwrap UVW modifier right after the editable poly and before the symmetry modifier. So from here, what we want to do is we actually want to handle this head in two parts. Now there are many ways that you can set up the UV coordinates for this head, but for this exercise what we're going to do is we're going to use a cylindrical projection mapping for the majority of the head, and pelt mapping, which is a new feature in 3D Studio Max 8, for the ear, because it is a very, very complex shape. So if we jump back down and we go into face sub-object mode, jump over to our left viewport so we have a clear view of the majority of the faces. We turn off ignore back facing, and then we change our marquee mode to paint. Hold down Control on the keyboard and just go over and paint our selection. Now we want to avoid the ear because we're going to be handling that separately. So we just want to get the majority of the faces, everything except for the ear, and there's a little bit in front of it. So now that we have it, let's rotate around, make sure we got everything we wanted to, and yep, looks good. Okay, so now that we have this, we move down to map parameters. Now underneath map parameters, you'll see that we have 5 options. We have planar, pelt, cylindrical, spherical, and box. Now planar, cylindrical, spherical, and box are very similar to the projection methods found in UV map modifier. Pelt is a new feature that I mentioned, and we'll be using that in the next tutorial. Now what we want to do here is we want to use a cylindrical method for our projection because we want the texture to flow nicely around the head. Now you can see it's currently facing the wrong direction, so we use the align tools, or the align buttons here, to choose the correct orientation. So in our case it was align Y. Now if we take a look at our top viewport, we'll notice that our mesh is not completely within our cylindrical gizmo. So what we need to do now is we need to scale our cylindrical gizmo up and center it on where the center of our head will be. You'll notice that if it's not centered, we get all these additional green lines. These green lines are seams, which are discontinuities in the UV layout. So we want to make sure that we only have one nice seam going right down the middle here. Okay, and just make sure that we got a little bit of space all around. Okay, looks good. So now that we have this all set up, we can get out of cylindrical mode, clicking on cylinder, and before we go in and do some fine modifications to the actual texture coordinates, we want to be able to see the effect that we're having on it. So to do this, we're going to just apply a very simple checker pattern to our object. Now if you press M to bring up the material editor, you'll see that we already have a checker pattern set up for us. All we need to do is turn on the ability to see it in the viewport with the blue and white checkered box. Okay, so let's just take a quick overview of what we have here. We can see many stretched out areas here. Okay, ideally, each of these checkers should be square. Okay, and that's far from the case. So, now that we have this all set up, underneath Parameters on the right hand side, we click on Edit. This brings up our Edit UVs dialog box. Now the first thing that we want to do is we want to only focus on the face here. We don't care about the ear, because we'll handle that later. So what we can do is we can tell Max to hide everything except for the faces that we have selected with this button down here. It's called Filter Selected Faces. Click on that, the ear goes away. Now another thing that we want to do just for initial setup is underneath Options. There's a couple things that we want to change here. First, we want to make sure that tile bitmap is off. Next, we want to make sure that constant update is on. And what constant update is when we start pulling points around in here, we'll be able to see the effect in real time in our viewports. Okay, so now that we have this, we want to deselect everything. And usually, when you first start setting up your texture coordinates, one of the first things you want to do is make sure that the texture coordinates came in correctly. So we go up to Select and do Select Inverted Faces. Now inverted faces are pretty nasty, especially if you want to go over into another package such as ZBrush and use it for creating displacement maps or normal maps. So you'll see that the majority of our faces are all inverted. So what we want to do here is we want to click and drag over all of our faces, click on the mirror tool, and position this in our little square here. Now we can also resize this with this little apparatus that's surrounding our selection. If we click and drag on one of the corners, we can scale it. If we click and drag on one of the sides, we can rotate, or if we click and drag in the middle, we can move. Now this apparatus is achieved through the freeform mode. We can also just move, rotate, or scale our selection. But freeform is a pretty nice tool for UV coordinates. Okay, so now what we want to do is let's take a look at one trouble area, the top of the head. If we take a look at our actual UV coordinates here, you can see that this one face going right along the top of the head here is stretched significantly. So it's using up a lot of pixels, whereas other ones are not using up much at all. So what we want to do is we want to fix this. And one easy way of doing so is using the Relax tool in 3D Studio Max. So if we just select the various vertices that we want, so we'll just select these, go up to Tools, Relax Dialog, make sure that it's set to Relax by Edge Angles, and then just click Apply. You'll notice that it rounded out the top of the head there, thus making the top in our viewport much clearer and much more uniform. This is what we want to do for the rest of the head. So we basically want to go into trouble areas, which is the chin here, and we can run the relax several times to try to get the effect that we want. You may often need to go in and start tweaking these a little bit more. Now, when setting up your UVs, make sure that you don't have any ambiguous quads. Right here, you'll notice that if I don't move this point, it looks just very close to a triangle. And this can lead to some other problems down the line. So make sure that you have easily distinguishable quads. Okay, so now let's take a look at another trouble area, namely the eye. If we zoom in really close to the eye, you'll see that we have a lot of overlapping parts. You can see how there are several faces that are all overlapping. So what we want to do is we want to flatten that out so there are no overlapping parts. So we're going to switch over, make sure we're in vertex mode, go to our paint select mode, click on the plus sign a couple times to increase our brush size, and then we just click and drag over all the vertices that we want to work with. Now in this case we only want to work with the ones directly surrounding the eye. Now if we click on the relax by edge angles, notice what happens. It still keeps a lot of them all bunched up, and the more I click this, it doesn't seem to be fixing it. They just seem to be collapsing onto themselves. So instead of the relax by edge angles, we're going to choose relax by centers. Click on that, and now you'll notice that it's much cleaner. We can now zoom in, switch over to our paint tool again, select these various points, just these first two rows, go to scale, scale them in, can switch over to edges, select one of these, edges in the second row, and back on the right hand side here we can use actually the ring and loop tools to speed up our selection. So there we go. We now have a much cleaner eye socket. So continue to do that for the rest of the head, and we'll then jump ahead to where this is all done. Okay, so there we go. Now I have the UVs all laid out for the face. Areas such as the mouth, the nose, and the eye, some common trouble areas, as well as the chin, top of the head. Now one thing that you want to check out is you want to make sure that you don't have any inverted or overlapped faces. This just makes for a very clean UV layout and ensures that you'll be able to use other tools with confidence. Now if we choose overlapped faces, notice that we have one right at the corner of the mouth. So if we zoom in really close, go to edit vertex mode, and just move this vertex out of the way. Go back to face mode, select overlapping faces, and we no longer have any. So be sure to run those periodically to make sure that you have a nice clean UV layout. So if we look over in our actual viewport at what's happening here, you can see that it's fairly uniform. There are some areas with a little bit of stretching, but none of which will make or break the actual end result. Okay, so that'll do it for this tutorial. In the next one we'll handle the ear, as well as mirroring the two sides, welding them together, and then creating an image or a guide that we can use in Photoshop to paint our texture. If you have any questions, feel free to email me or post on the forums. Thanks.